Our scripture reading this morning began with the story in Exodus, the first chapter in Exodus. And the story in Exodus begins where Genesis leaves off. The Israelites are saved from a great famine because Joseph has come to a prominent position of power in the kingdom of Egypt, and he's stored away food enough to keep the people of Egypt fed, as well as all those refugees who've come in. As I said earlier, Joseph's story is one of highs and lows, from being his father's favorite to being dropped into a pit by his brothers, from being sold into slavery to being the manager of a prominent household, from being thrown into prison to interpreting dreams for Pharaoh and becoming the second in command in Egypt, to reuniting with the brothers who once wished him dead and becoming a vehicle for their salvation from a great famine. As we said before, the song our children sang last Sunday came from their study of Joseph, and it became our prayer this week. Turn our sadness upside down. Take our tears and turn them round. Touch us, heal us, lift us up when we fall down. Turn our sadness upside down. Joseph's story is one of highs and lows, of suffering and restoration, of redemption and transformation. And then in the beginning of Exodus, we hear those fateful words. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. I always want to say, dun, 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 right there at that verse, because you know something is changing. And it's not changing for the better. The Israelites who entered Egypt for refuge sometime before have flourished. Verse 7 says that they were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and they grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. Thus, the promise of God to Abraham is taking shape. That promise made in Genesis 12, where God says to Abram, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. The Israelites have become numerous, too numerous for the comfort of the Egyptians. And so, out of fear, the Egyptians enslave them. Fear causes us to treat one another atrociously. Take, for example, the decree to the midwives from Pharaoh. He says, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, she shall live. But those midwives risk their lives and do not obey Pharaoh, and they allow those baby boys to live. And as you would expect, these two midwives, who are so instrumental that their names are recorded in Scripture, Shiphrah and Puah, are called before Pharaoh to answer for their actions. And Pharaoh says, I told you not to allow the baby boys to live. And I love their response. I love it. Well, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and they give birth before the midwife comes to them. Another translation puts it this way, because the Hebrew women aren't like Egyptian women. They are much stronger, and they give birth before any midwives can get to them. And that's quite bold to say, standing before your ruler and your oppressor. But it seems Pharaoh accepted their answer, and he turned to the Egyptian people to do the dirty work. Verse 22 says, Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. How How can this situation possibly be righted? The Israelites are in danger. God's promise is in danger. The people's already unimaginable suffering increases. The end is in sight. As T.S. Eliot writes, the eternal footman is holding their coat and snickering, and they are afraid. Death has come to their door. What is greater than death? It seems hopeless. Every boy shall be thrown into the Nile. And the Nile is exactly where we find the baby boy. He will be the answer to the Israelites' prayers and be God's agent of life and the hope of the promise. Our story shifts once again at the beginning of chapter 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. We, the reader, know the birth of this baby is the beginning of Israel's redemption. Yet, the Israelites still live under the burden of oppression, and even with the birth of the one God will send to lead them out of slavery, there is still much suffering to endure and many years of waiting in hope. Even when it appears God is not working, God is working in ways that we cannot imagine, because for Moses to be born at all is a miracle. And then for him to be hidden for 3 months by his mother and then hidden again in a basket placed in the Nile River, only to be found by none other than the Pharaoh's daughter, who recognizes him as a Hebrew child and chooses to rebel against her father's decree by not only keeping him alive, but also allowing his own mother to nurse him. And then she goes about raising him under the Pharaoh's nose in the royal court. For even death could not thwart God's promise, for life always finds a way. This is the great turnaround. Thank you, Richard Rohr, for that phrase. The great turnaround. Death is never the end. Sin and suffering and failure and misery are never the end, for in God's hands they become the raw materials of life, of my life, of your life, of humanity's life. Yes, Gina, you might say to me, we know that death is not the end. That's what we've been taught all our lives. Jesus was resurrected, and so shall we be, to be with him in heaven. Well, yes, that too. But I'm also talking about the here and the now. There are many kinds of death. Death of a marriage, death of a career, death of a perspective, death of a friendship, death of a dream, and many, many more. But death is never the end, for life always has the last word. And when life does re-emerge, it is many times not quite what we expect. When the adult Moses reappears on the scene in Egypt post-burning bush and his commissioning, his presence does not immediately scream, "This is your deliverer." This stuttering murderer who fled to Midian to escape punishment. I mean, what kind of a leader is this? But life will not be thwarted. The Apostle Paul writes to the church in Rome, "We know that all things work together for good for those who love God." Everything works for good. Not everything is good, but everything works for good. God can use anything for good. God is always ahead of us, working to redeem us. Think again about our Exodus scripture for today. Death threatened the promise. Yet just when things seemed their bleakest and their darkest, God sent a baby, born to a Hebrew woman who then grew up in the Pharaoh's household to lead them out of slavery and toward God's promise that they might be a blessing to the world. And this Moses was not the conquering hero they were probably looking for, but he turned out to be exactly what the Israelites needed. Suffering and slavery led to freedom and covenant. Out of death comes life. The great turnaround. The Israelite story is one of redemption and transformation, and our story is one of redemption and transformation. For their story is our story. God sent a baby to show us who God is and how much we are loved. But this baby was not who we were looking for. We wanted the powerful hero on the white horse. Instead, God came quietly in a stable, born to a very poor couple. Not exactly where we would expect to find a king. And this baby grew into a man who was compassionate and merciful and healed people and taught them about God and God's way. But we loved power way too much, and we wanted to do life our own way. And we didn't understand that our attempts at our kind of life only leads to death. And so we killed him to silence his voice. What a dark day. The darkest day of all. The suffering and the death of the one who ushered in God's kingdom and embodied mercy and compassion and grace. Jesus, dead. On that Friday, how could this situation possibly be righted? God's promise is in danger. Death has come to the door. What is greater than death? It seems hopeless. And just when things seem their bleakest and their darkest, life emerges. Jesus is resurrected. Jesus is alive. And God says again, look, life is stronger than death. Death does not have the last word. Life always comes after death. All things work together for good for those who love God. Now this is good news. This is good news. It changes everything. It is the great turnaround. Death is never the end. Sin and suffering and failure and misery are never the end, for in God's hands they are always the raw materials of life, of my life, of your life, of humanity's life. Jesus promises us this in the Matthean passage that we read today. He tells Peter, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the powers of death shall not prevail against it." We are Jesus' followers, and we are assured that death has no power over us. Yes, we will suffer, sometimes because of others' choices, and sometimes because of our own choices. We will sin. There will be failure and misery. We will physically die. But these are only raw materials in God's hands, and God uses them to craft life. Life beyond the suffering. Life beyond the sin and the failure and the misery. Life beyond death. Life. God crafts life. Earlier we sang, "Great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. Thou changest not, thy compassions, they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever wilt be. Great is God's faithfulness. For God has been ahead of us the whole time, working for our redemption, our personal redemption and our redemption as a whole. God has been and is ahead of us, creating life. Death is not the end. Life always comes after death. All kinds of death. So what would happen if we, the followers of Jesus, the great church, the ones Jesus speaks of here in Matthew, lived our lives embodying this good news? What a good word and a promise for not only us, but for our world. This is hope when life is miserable. This is motivation to persevere when life holds only suffering. This is faith in the face of great doubt. This gives courage in the midst of fear. What a difference this makes. That God is working for our good, that God brings life out of death, that this not only happens after our physical death, but happens now. In all the deaths we experience over a lifetime, our God brings life, not death, life, always, always, always. Thanks be to God. Here at Immanuel, we are a community of faith, striving to follow Jesus and live like Jesus lived every single day. And we strive to live in this hope that life does get the last word, and God uses everything for good. We invite you to live this life of faith alongside us, committing yourself publicly as a follower of Jesus and joining in the journey of faith with this body. If you would like to do so and become part of this body of believers, we invite you to come forward as we sing hymn number 68, He Leadeth Me, O Blessed Thought. Let us sing together.